When we think of social leaders, we think of a certain kind of personality. People who have dedicated their lives to demonstrating moral leadership, building institutions, leading social movements, and whose work has been instrumental in strengthening the fabric of Indian society, our Samaj. But what are their stories? How do they come to this path? What events shape their perspectives? Who influenced their choices? And what are they working on now? Welcome to Grassroots Nation, a podcast from Rohini Nilekani Philanthropies, a show in which we dive deep into the life, work, and guiding philosophies of some of our country's greatest leaders of social change. These are individuals whose work has been instrumental in shaping Indian society. If we live with a sense of possibility today, it is because we stand on the shoulders of these giants. In this first episode of Grassroots Nation, we meet a pioneer of sustainable development, someone who is thinking about our environment and our collective future well before climate change became a phrase we hear about daily. Dr. Ashok Khosla is an environmental visionary and the founder and chairman of Development Alternatives. He's built institutions globally that have been at the forefront of environmental work. He shaped and designed India's early environmental frameworks and set India's course for sustainable development. He also believes that it's possible to do good and to do good business. An experimental physicist by training, Dr. Khosla's early memories were marked by partition. He went on to study science, first at Cambridge University and then at Harvard University. Dr. Khosla helped design and teach the first undergraduate course on the environment at Harvard University. And as a young man, he worked with Roger Revelle, one of the pioneers who studied global warming, an experience Dr. Khosla credits with changing the course of his life. Ashok Khosla led a peripatetic life, one marked by huge achievements, but he could never shake off India, which in his own words was in his DNA, and it is what led him to return here to work on one of the most intractable development issues, innovations for livelihoods. A man with a deep love for the job, a wry sense of humor, and an absolute technophile and self-confessed gadget geek, Dr. Ashok Khosla is in conversation with his longtime colleague and friend, the CEO of Development Alternatives, Shrashtant Patara.
Good afternoon, Dr. Khosla. It's such a pleasure to be with you here today. It's not often that we get a chance to talk about the journey of development alternatives, the 40 long years over which DA as an organization has grown, and the world has also changed in many ways.
Hi, Pat. It's the first time you called me Dr. Khosla for a long time, so I'm very honored, but I'm just as happy if you address me as Ashok, as the normal way. I have had an awesome 40 years with you guys. It's been a terrific journey, and I'm so glad that we have a chance to reminisce a little bit and talk about where we've been and where we ought to be going.
So Ashok, a lot of the people, when they talk to us, they just cannot believe that you did nuclear physics at Harvard and then ended up setting up Development Alternatives. So how did you get to Harvard? What happened there?
Well, the answer to that question is, to some extent, I could have dropped physics because I was no good at it, or I had some very deep reason to do something else. And I think I'd like to think it's the second, that when I was very young, I grew up in an academic household. My parents were university teachers. We, at partition, left Lahore, where we used to live, and go back to where our grandparents lived in Kashmir. One evening in late October 1947, the Pakistani government sent raiders in, and they were pretty awful people. They did nasty things. And all of a sudden, the lights went off because they got to the power station in Baramulla, and we were left with no electricity, and lots of shouting outside, saying, "You better get out of here. you will be killed or raped and you don't have much time.
पता ही नहीं लगा तब तक जब तक गोलियों का भूचाल हो गया
और उन्होंने लूट खसुट का मतलब कोई मतलब इम्तियाज ही नहीं रखा.
I was walking through the streets. I saw green flags you see hanging and everybody very stunned, dumb.
उन्होंने ये तमीज नहीं देखा कि ये हिंदू है, ये सिख है, ये मुसलमान है.
And my mother had a few canisters of petrol, and we commandeered the next door neighbor's car, filled it up with the petrol, and started driving towards Jammu, towards civilization. And basically, it was an adventurous journey. We ran out of petrol. We walked for 5 or 6 days down to Jammu, down the hills, up mountains, and all over the place, and ended up in a refugee camp here in Delhi. My father was an eminent professor. He was invited to join the Foreign Service, went off to London and took us with him. And we grew up for most of our youth in England and in Europe. What happened basically was that it's all about DNA, really. But a DNA that evolves, not just purely but genetically, but in the form of experience. And my DNA was India. My whole being was about how I could be a citizen of my own country and be able to contribute to it from a very early age. And when I went to school in England, I fell in love with science. I used to read science. I couldn't stop reading science. I used to do laboratory work. I was convinced that the only thing in life was to be a physicist and to get a Nobel Prize. That was the driving force for many years. So I did that. I was in school, high school and boarding school in England, and then from there I went to college in England, where I got a degree in natural sciences. And from there, I went to Harvard to do a PhD in experimental physics. It was a great opportunity to grow and learn. And remember that almost everything in the back of my mind was, will this be useful in India? So at that time, at Harvard, I was given an opportunity by an amazing professor. He allowed me more or less to do whatever I wanted. And being at Harvard, what I wanted to do was learn everything. So I went to the business school and basically got an informal MBA in the sense I didn't have a certificate. I went to the economics department and went to all the lectures. And I studied literature and other things too, because that was fun. But essentially, one day I realized at the age of 31 that I was basically indulging myself too much. It was great experience and great learning, but I was putting off the date to getting home. So I wrapped up my luggage, and my parents sent me a ticket, and I came home. At Harvard, I was not only learning a lot of things I thought would be useful for India, but I was also running businesses. And basically, one of the businesses that I was running was a computer data management system. And we had a big computer, so I was really making a certain amount of money and doing something that was interesting. During the summers, I did something that no graduate student would ever think of doing, which is selling encyclopedias door to door. And that was an unusual experience. I think in some ways, those 3 months, 1 month in each of 3 years that I worked, I learned more about people, about management, about managing one's time, and a lot of other things that I did in the whole of my Harvard studies for 10 years. So basically, I was a mix of an academic and a business person at that time. And I was making really, enormous money, and I was having a great time. The one thing that I did at that time, which was very life-changing for me, was to teach a course with a second professor who was also a gigantic intellect. His name was Roger Revelle, and he was the one who discovered climate change. He was an oceanographer. He found that the amount of carbon in the oceans wasn't matching the amount that it should be there, and he asked the National Academy of Sciences to conduct some experiments, measurements of carbon dioxide, and wrote a paper on climate change. And he and I taught a course on environment. It was the first university course anywhere in the world, and it was a very visible, almost emblematic course, which was taken by 300 or 400 students. It was a big course, and I was teaching sections of those. And my students included Vice President Al Gore, Benazir Bhutto, who became Prime Minister of Pakistan later on, and a lot of other people who now headline material. So Professor Revelle, who was really more a family than a professor for me because we worked together a great deal, wrote to Mrs. Gandhi, Indira Gandhi, saying that I was insisting on coming home and that she should help me find a job. So as soon as I got home, I was given this letter from the Prime Minister's office saying I should meet them, and she was setting up a Ministry of Environment, which wasn't quite a ministry at the time. It was an agency under the Ministry of Science and Technology. I basically was offered the job of setting it up and running it, which is really quite extraordinary because I was only 31 years old at the time. But and I was not IAS. I was an outsider and so on. But it sounded like a good thing. But my re-entry into India after nearly 20 odd years wasn't good. It was rather disastrous. I'd been brainwashed by the West, and so to me everything in Delhi seemed to be non-functional. And I basically packed up my bags again, one bag, and went off to Goa and became a hippie, and I had a great time. And then I got a call from the Prime Minister's office saying, I thought you were going to start this thing up. So I decided to come back, and we started it up.
Yeah, we've been looking for photographs from that time in Goa, and we have not found any.
No, there aren't any.
But just to go back for a moment, was it those years at Harvard where you learned how to work, 84 hours at a stretch, and
yes,
something that's troubled us till date? Because
I know. I'm trying to get out of those bad habits, but being in a university, the clock doesn't work. And my lab was there all night for me to work. And during the daytime, I could go to lectures and talk to people and so on. So, yes, what I tried to do when we set up DA was to give my young co-workers an opportunity to do the things that I had an opportunity to do, which was make good use of time. There was always some cafeteria open at night and you could go and eat, but every minute counted. So to some extent, that has infected DA and hopefully for the good. But basically, being a graduate student meant making full use of every resource you had, including time. Basically, after that, I ran this Office of Environment, which was for 5 years the most powerful job I can ever imagine. Everybody thought that I was reporting to the Prime Minister, so anything I said was seen as word from the top. And I went around stopping factories, doing all kinds of outrageous stuff, which very quickly led me to an understanding of what environment meant for India. Everybody used to laugh at me and said, what are you doing in India? This is a poor country. What are you talking about pollution and why? It was a laughing matter, actually, for a long time that I was working on these issues. But in a way, that experience in India, those 5 years, led to the whole concept of sustainability. Because later on, I was in a position to put that into the global jargon. And sustainability was a way of seeing the environmental issues as being tractable for a poor country. You don't say no, you say yes, but. You have to find ways in which you can get your cake and eat it. And so, in those days, I had to deal with projects like the Mathura refinery, like Chilka Lake, like Kashmir's environmental issues and so on. These are very high visibility issues. And I got very deeply involved with the global environmental movements since I was the government delegate to all the conferences, including the big Stockholm conference, which started the whole process.
Stockholm, Sweden, June 12, 1972. Mrs. Indira Gandhi, Prime Minister of India, arrived today to address the first United Nations Conference on the Human Environment.
It is clear that the environmental crisis which is confronting the world will profoundly alter the future destiny of our planet. No one amongst us, whatever our status, strength, or circumstance, can remain unaffected.
This meant that I got invited to join the UN to help set up the headquarters in Nairobi of the UN program. Infoterra was the information program in the environment program, UNEP. And basically that was the starting point of a global presence.
Every day in every country, exhaust fumes from motor cars spew greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, contributing to global warming. This could lead to ruined crops, rising sea levels. Entire countries could disappear. At the United Nations Earth Summit, world leaders will discuss ways to prevent such disasters.
I was all over the place. I went to 110 countries trying to get governments to set up agencies, but that also meant that I could get involved with the Club of Rome, with IUCN, with the International Resource Panel, etc. So when I was back in Delhi, at the end of it all, after the UN, I set up Development Alternatives. I was still one leg in the international system. And that leg was only possible because I had huge colleagues, a set of colleagues who could provide me with the intellectual support to be able to influence the global scene. I became president of the IUCN, and that's a very big organization, scientific organization for conservation. Then I was also involved with the Club of Rome, which really, in a sense, started the whole environmental movement with this book called Limits to Growth. And I became president of that and varieties of other things. Later on, I set up and chaired the International Resource Panel, which does what IPCC does for climate, it does for resources. And I headed that for 10 years. So that was a very active time during which I was in airplanes most of the time. But it brought in lots of ideas and information and support for the work of DA.
In 1983, Ashok Khosla set up Development Alternatives with the vision of creating an organization that could do good business and contribute to sustainable development at the same time. His life and work are deeply entwined. He's a firm believer in the power of the collective to solve big problems, like-minded people working together. And when he speaks, his relationships with his colleagues stand out. Development Alternatives, or DA as he calls it, was born during his time with UNEP, where he was trying to build a business plan for a social enterprise that also focused on innovation.
I think the first question that anyone asks when they want to know more about development alternatives is why. Why was development alternatives set up? Why did you take that step back in the early 80s?
Mainly because many of my colleagues and I had been giving a lot of thought to the way things are in the world, and we came to the conclusion that it wasn't the way it should be, and the existing institutions were not capable of dealing with the problems the way they needed to be. I had a bunch of friends. It was a time when I was involved with the government of India and with the UN, and we used to meet in conferences and high-level meetings in airports, and instead of continuing to gripe about how bad things were, some of us decided we better do something. So a bunch of us, these two people at that time, Christian Delight, a wonderful Canadian, and myself, one day resigned from our jobs, more or less on the same day, turned up in Delhi, and we decided to start developing alternatives. And it's been an amazing journey since.
I remember first having met Christian at your house, in fact, in your garage, where a lot of us started working. But in all this, there must have been a point where you decided that a new kind of institution is required. So what triggered that?
The lack of institutional frameworks that could deliver what was needed. But what was needed? What is needed at that time, and still is, the eradication of poverty, extreme poverty throughout the world, and regeneration of the natural resource base. Conserving our heritage in terms of nature was as important for us as the twin problem of poverty. And these two had to be dealt with together. And we didn't see many institutions doing that. So we felt that this was a niche that we had to fill to bring about a different kind of a world in which people and nature mattered. We also had, in a sense, a proximate reason why we wanted to do this. And it was an internal, a personal reason, because most of the partners that I worked with in conceiving development alternatives were driven by a sense of outrage, an individual, specific outrage that the world should be so unfair, so unjust, and I think that was the most important driving force, the desire to see a better world for everyone and for the long term. The issues were so big and so complex and so urgent that we thought that the existing institutions of governance, of government, of international agencies, of big business, and even NGOs were not adequate to deal with them. And we came to the conclusion that we needed to have a hybrid type of institution that would bring the strengths of all these existing institutions and not many of the weaknesses together into a new kind of enterprise, which we call a social enterprise. At that time, there were no such things, and basically received wisdom was that there couldn't be such a thing. In fact, I was very privileged during the preparation of the work that led to development alternatives to meet a lot of very eminent thinkers and management experts. And I even met Peter Drucker, the guru of management. And he looked at me, and at that time I was a bit younger, and he said, "Young man, you can either make money or do good. You can't do both." And the received wisdom was that you either did a big business and make a lot of money, or you set up an NGO and do a lot of impact. And my feeling and Christian's feeling was that that was not adequate.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because the phrase or the sentence that you use, development is good business, was one of the first things that attracted a lot of us at that time to development alternatives. The period that we're talking about is the mid-80s. Liberalization had not kicked in yet. It came a bit later. And you must have been among the first people who talked about using entrepreneurship, markets that existed in India as the way they were, as a means of engineering change. Was it blasphemous to many that you could do the work of the government or, what would normally be done through charity in such a manner?
Certainly within the civil society sector, it was blasphemous. We got a lot of flack, and we were not ostracized because our intentions were seen to be good, but frankly, our methodologies were suspect because for most NGOs and voluntary organizations, business is the enemy. It's the cause of the problems, and we were espousing some of their methods, and that wasn't congenial to the local thinking. But I would say that the logic behind what we were doing was pretty strong, and although I'm not sure we've had a large number of organizations clone what we do yet, which would be a good sign of success. But there are a lot more today, people wanting to call themselves social enterprises than there were at that time, yeah.
How did we get the engine up and running?
For us, numbers were important. Quality of change and the scale of change were both a given from the beginning. If you could change the lives of a few people in a village, I think that's a wonderful thing to do. And we had no problem with that. And we encouraged our colleagues to do exactly that. But if you were going to deal with problems at the scale that they demanded, poverty and hunger and resource degradation are massive scale issues, then you had to match that scale with the solutions. There's a law in cybernetics called Ashby's law, which basically says that the scale of the complexity of your problem needs to be matched by the scale and complexity of your solutions. And that makes sense. And so for us, scale was very deeply embedded. And in order to do that, we had 2 or 3 secrets. One was the application of good business management methods. There are very few organizations in the world that do better at scaling up than big businesses. And the second was partnerships, by doing things with other people, causing things to be done by other people. And very early in the game, probably when we were 2 or 3 years old, we got the idea that it was very much in line with Indian thinking, Indian culture, to cause things to be done. In fact, our language, our very way of speaking, embodies that. It's the only language system, the Indic languages, that have a tense called the causative. And this causative tense is a way of saying get something done as well as doing it yourself. And you take a verb like banana, to make. It comes with a causative tense called banwana. And banwana means get someone to make it for you. And it goes very deeply into our culture to make and share and partner. So our approach in a logo, in a slogan sense internally, the way we communicate with each other, is we are trying to go the banwana route rather than the banana route. You can either set up large factories or you can make the same things in small factories, which you enable through your innovations. So for us, scale is important, and the means of scaling up is even more.
For many, and I'd say most of us, from the time I joined Development Alternatives till date, I think this is a distinction that is often difficult to grapple with because, if you're talking about roti kapda makan, or, if you're talking about taking care of, nature, it's much more natural for someone to want to just go and do it. I think people that join our organization, that's the kind of motivation they come with. So when they're told, no, it's not about you're going and building a house for someone, but figuring out, ways in which millions of people can build houses.
Absolutely. And Pat, the other side of that coin is just as important. People, organizations, individuals normally need to get credit for what they do. And this banwana business gives credit to other people. So it's also a matter of thinking different about how you get rewarded. And in our case, we were willing to give up that reward that you get with people saying, you did this, by enabling other people to do it.
In 1986, going back now, what would it be, 36 years or so, one of the things that got me hooked, this was when you'd come to deliver a lecture at the School of Planning and Architecture, was the emphasis at DA on systems and systems thinking. Why have you from the very beginning, thought that systemic thinking is absolutely essential?
Part of the reason is that I was always intrigued by systems and studied them. So professionally, I was, interested in application of systems thinking. But more important than that was the fact that basically most of the issues that we were looking at, hunger, poverty, destruction of soils and lands and forests, all of these had very complex intersectional causes. And in order to deal with them, you had no choice but to be systemic. So we just found there was no way to get permanent solutions that were equitable, that were efficient, without looking at all the parts together. So a holistic approach, a systems approach, to whatever we did, whether it was for water or for sanitation or for energy or for housing, for example, was all embedded in an understanding of the interlinkages between all these. And there's another reason. DA, Development Alternatives, is an organization that has a subtext. It has a sub-goal underlying everything, and that is to build the leaders of tomorrow. The people who will be, whose lives we're dealing with and who will be responsible for other people's lives in the future. And for young people, they have to recognize that the world is changing so rapidly that it's no use having specific skills. If you can code computers, it's great. You can do coding. But the kinds of jobs that you will be doing in 10, 15 years' time have nothing to do with coding. You've got to do... And we came to the conclusion that the one skill that everyone will be needing is how to deal with changing circumstances. And there's nothing better than systems thinking for that. So we really tried to build that into our thinking, because without being able to connect the dots, the kinds of changes that are taking place with climate change, biodiversity loss, species extinction, we're going to have to live in a different world. And your training in universities and in schools, not just in India, but all over the world, but we're concerned with India, was really how to learn skills to do a particular thing, which is of importance today. But it won't be tomorrow and day after. And a large part of the systems thinking, the modeling, all the tricks of the trade were critically important. And that's why we lay so much emphasis on that.
You brought the first personal computer into the country. I and a lot of other people had so much fun fooling around with it in 1986, 87, 88.
When you're dealing with higher volumes of information and need answers fast, you search everywhere for solutions, but find it hard to get on top of things. That's why IBM created the personal computer AT, with the power to push high performance even higher.
Sure, you remind me, in 1982, when the IBM PC was first launched, I booked one and flew all the way to New York from Nairobi to pick it up. And I was transferring to India. And so I was allowed a certain amount of imports. And I smuggled the computer in. And I was allowed to do that because the customs officer kindly took my explanation, which was that it's a new kind of television. And I brought it home. The reason that it was so important in our lives was that it was the best recruitment tool that I ever had. Because of that, we call her the old lady, because she was very, very important in our lives. Half of the toppers from IIT and SPA were interested in coming to work with us, and we had a terrific time. So this gadget, the PC, which is terribly rudimentary. I mean, it was 8K memory. I mean, it was ridiculous how weak it was. Embodied for us not only a way of doing our work better, but how to apply it for our work in the development arena.
If we may, let's go back to those early years. You talked about hunger, poverty, land degradation. But do you think things have changed? 30 to 40 years down the line, do those problems remain? Have they taken a different form, or have solutions been found to some of them?
There are a few areas where there are solutions being found and being propagated in food production, in food processing, and energy areas and so on, but nowhere near enough. And the result of that is that the actual problems of hunger and malnutrition and loss of resources are actually worse today than they were 40 years ago. So to some extent, it is our urban perception that things are improving. But actually, you and I work in the villages, and we can see a great deal more needs to be done. And it's not really changed very much since we started and 40 years ago. So I would say the answer to your very important insight is that all the efforts of governments, business, NGOs, everybody, to find solutions have still not actually solved the fundamental problems of the country, which is of large numbers, literally, 3/4 of the country being left behind in the economy in terms of physical health, of their education, their intellectual health, and in many other ways. So the answer to your question is no, we haven't been able to deal with them at the scale needed.
Does it still trouble you that we might be two countries, that there's an India and there's a Bharat?
Yeah, very deeply. That's really the issue. Not because they have different cultures, which is wonderful, but because they haven't benefited from each other, except through exploitative labor relations. There is really no real contact between them. It's improving, but the hope in their lives, the aspirations and the actuality in their lives is a huge gap. And frankly, it bothers me a lot, yeah.
The Mahatma, Gandhi ji, was a significant inspiration in evolving not just your approach to development, but, I dare say, how to approach life itself. What kind of values, espoused by Gandhiji, have you found important in the work that you've done and Development Alternatives has done?
Today, referring to Gandhiji as an inspiration has is a handicap, because young people don't seem to think that's terribly relevant. And even older people. I was on a conference call the other day, and I was talking about our Gandhian approach to marketing and so on. And they found that a little bit odd, even pretty eminent people. I've had a very variable relationship with Gandhi. I was in a boarding school in England, and I had to write a student essay, one of those big, essays that you get a prize for, and in the graduation you get a certificate and so on. And I chose to write it about Gandhi. And it was, looking back on it, pretty critical. I mean, I was 17, it was 10 years after Gandhi had been assassinated. And frankly, I was very skeptical about his view of development as vis-a-vis India. It seemed to be, to me at that time when I was 17, a little bit ancient and out of reality. out of touch with reality. However, when we set up Development Alternatives, it was not seen as a Gandhian institution. I didn't see it as a Gandhian institution. But as we developed it and we started working with technologies and with empowerment and with the issues of community development and so on, each one of the Gandhian concepts from Sarvodaya all the way to Antodaya and in between kept coming up. So by the time DA was about 5 years old, willy-nilly, we had become a Gandhian institution. We were worried about sufficiency, about waste, about all the kinds of things. Gandhiji was an incredible ecologist, ecosystem person. He really understood. He was a systems person, He understood all these connections between different parts of life. And frankly, our espousal of Gandhian thinking is actually from a practical point of view, not something that is ideological. Because when we started selling handmade paper, we were forced to think about where the money flows. And it's the importance of local economy and impacts was a purely Gandhian thing. And, it was aha. When we figured out what we were doing, Gandhiji had already thought about a long, long time ago. So appropriate technology, it's Fritz Schumacher was a Gandhian. So a lot of our stuff that we were doing was very similar to Schumacherian principles, which were Gandhian principles. So actually we sort of got drawn into Gandhi as a practical matter. It wasn't something that we got up as a religious or an ethical or a moral ideology. It was obvious that was the way to go. Gandhiji was incredibly insightful about society, about people, and now, his religious end we're not very much into, so I can't say much. But all I can say is, if we have views of economics, ecology, work, trade, and so on, it's Gandhian.
Globally, you must be among the 5 or 6 people who'd actually predicted climate change. Do you think the world responded too slowly to those predictions?
Pretty well to all predictions except ozone were slow. To biodiversity loss, it's even slower. Extinction of species is going at a rate right now that is truly a threat to human life, to civilization, to life on Earth. But basically, I was among, as you say, the first half dozen people to plant a flag for each one of these things. At Rio, where I was chairperson of the NGOs and subsequently. Look, the word sustainable development was first printed in a book called The World Conservation Strategy, of which I was a co-author. We took that, put it into the Brundtland Commission, where I was a member, and that led to Rio Earth Summit. And all of these things were known, but nothing has been done about them. Very little has been done about them. And it's painful to see missed opportunities. But being ahead of your time simply means you didn't communicate it well, I guess. And I think that's part of the reason one has to accept that it's your responsibility.
And yet you chose not to be an activist or to be an evangelist on these kind of issues.
Yeah, look, there are different ways to be activists. You're an activist when you go out there and work with the self-help groups and FPOs and so on. All of that is activism, and we do a lot of activism in various ways. Activism without solid thought and without solid action behind it, I think is meaningless.
I know you in particular have always believed in people per se, the kind of things people can do, right from the woman in the village to professionals to sometimes exceptional leaders that we've seen in civil society, in the corporate world, sometimes even in government. Have you, over these years, felt that it's been a lonely journey, or do you see, or did you see occasions in which you felt, people were actually coming together to further a cause, to collaborate, to work in partnerships?
Well, look, the experience of DA itself, which grew to be 700-800 people, obviously showed that there were a lot of people interested and totally committed. So that was never a basis for loneliness of that kind. The loneliness one feels in a professional job is that there are less than you would wish recognition of the possibilities that your innovations can create for the country. So there, I think it's important that we recognize that anyone working for a better world is going to be alone in many ways. There are not that many things. I can't complain. I have to tell you that my family was incredibly supportive of what we did. My father's greatest day in his life was when I resigned the job in the UN and came to work for 1/100th the amount salary in DA. He basically made it possible for us to start the organization. He paid for the land. And he was not a rich person, but my whole family, my wife, my parents, my kids, they all felt that this was something that was worthwhile, and I could not have done it without that kind of support from friends and from my colleagues. So being alone is a very stratospheric kind of feeling, being alone in the universe, but not locally. I mean, I think I got such incredible support from all the people we worked with and other NGOs and our partners that I don't think that was a real issue.
Were there moments in these 40 years when you thought it's not going to work out, or that we aren't able to do enough?
Yes, we're certainly not able to do enough because the problem is big, and that's a feeling you can see right now still. But there was never a time when the existence of what we had to do came into question. I mean, we really had a total commitment to see it through to the end. People used to say, "You must be feeling very frustrated." I said, "Frustrated for what? I mean, this is the job that we need to do. And any little success is actually the opposite of frustration. It's a reward, and it's life-giving." So, yeah, you're right. It's part of the DA thinking that this is a kind of privilege to be able to work on these issues in a way that makes a difference.
One of the things that has fascinated us as colleagues, over these 3 decades and more, is that for someone who can look so closely at problems and understand them in so much detail, you also give us a lot of hope. I mean, I'd say you radiate hope. You've almost written the textbook of hope as far as environment and development is concerned. So what would be your biggest, fears? You've mentioned some of them, but then also your most prominent hopes for the future.
Yeah, people say I'm an optimist, and I'm not sure what that means because it's not a religion. It's my hope comes from reasoned thinking about what we could be doing, and my hope comes from the fact that organizations like ours will have an impact on that thinking. So the hope has to be founded in some reality, a real potential for achieving it. And I think most of us who are problem solvers rather than problem explicators have ideas about how things can be different. So I would like to think that the hope that the world has is in recognizing that if there's anybody without hope, then there's no hope for everyone. So in a sense, if that woman in a Bundelkhand village where we work isn't going to have a better life, then it's going to have an impact on us too, partly through population growth, partly through destruction of forests and soils and rivers, partly through breakdown in the economy. And also, it is not inconceivable, though India may be an exception, for societies to break down and, destroy everything that we have been able to create so far in civilization. I don't think that we need to go into a dead end. We need really now to think of changing the relationships between people and nature, people and people.
It's, I think it's a question of waking up every morning and, remembering that if there's one person without hope, then there isn't much hope for all of us. Or, Robert Kennedy, you remind us often of, what he said.
Well, that's about creative solutions. A few minutes before he was assassinated, he was making a speech and he said, there are people around who look around them and ask, why are things so bad? I look around me and ask, why not? Why can't we solve them? So in a sense, that's what TA is about. We're in the business of solving those problems, which automatically means you've got hope. Otherwise, why would you be wasting time?
Thank you so much, Dr. Khosla. As always, every conversation with you is not just a pleasure, but it's a huge learning experience. I'd like to thank you for, the privilege of having, worked with you for more than 35 years now. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Pat. It's been a privilege to work with you and with all your colleagues. It's been rewarding. I must admit, Roger Revell, my partner in crime with climate change, used to say, he was already about 80 years old, used to say that he never had an academic year when he didn't teach a freshman class, because it was the only way to keep alive. So this is nice. For me, that's what I have. It's young people thinking, and you get new ideas every day.
Grassroots Nation is a podcast from Rohini Nilekani Philanthropies. For more information, go to rohininilekani-philanthropies.org or join the conversation on social media at RNP_Foundation. Stay tuned for our next episode featuring another great leader of social change. Thank you for listening to Grassroots Nation.